The fortress monastery of the Grey Knights lies on the moon of Titan. Deep within, locked away in the chamber said to hold the tomb of the Sigillite himself, rests a simple wooden box. Embellished with a golden seal, within this box, written upon ancient parchment, is the instruction known only as the Terminus Decree. Only the Supreme Grand Master of the chapter knows of its existence and how to open the box, but he will do so only when the future of humanity seems lost. The Terminus Decree is the ultimate sanction of the Grey Knights, a secret so vast it could bring the Imperium to its knees, or save it in its darkest hour. As the 41st millennium drew to a close, the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, sprang up. This series of warp storms has essentially divided the Milky Way galaxy. Almost immediately, many worlds were lost, and even Terra was threatened. Though the recently returned Reboot Guilliman has restored some semblance of stability, the effects of the Cicatrix Maledictum can still be felt across the Imperium. The Great Rift currently remains one of the greatest challenges facing the Imperium. With the warp spilling so much into reality, demons are manifesting in greater numbers, and so the Grey Knights have been massively overstretched. As things are looking so dire, the current Supreme Grand Master of the chapter, Kaldor Draigo, is forced to make a terrifying decision. He has appeared to each of the Grand Masters of the chapter in turn, asking them for their counsel. For the very first time in the chapter's history, the Supreme Grand Master is considering using the Terminus Decree. It is not up to the Inquisition, the High Lords of Terra, or even the Primarchs. Kaldor Draigo alone will decide the future of the Imperium. And if you are an Imperial citizen, one thing that may worry you even more is that he actually has no idea what this sanction entails. The only clue was a golden seal on the box that was rumoured to match a seal that is present on the Golden Throne of Terra. However, new information that we have suggests that even this was a red herring. We finally got information on what the Terminus Decree is in the Siege of Terra series, so I'm going to take you through the story of its creation and what the Imperium's most powerful and dangerous relic actually does. And if you're interested in getting some Warhammer relics of your own, you may be interested in the sponsor for today's video, Displate. You've probably noticed that I've had the metal posters from Displate up in my room for a while now. The quality of these is immense. I will say they don't just sell Warhammer posters, they do have a whole bunch of brands on their website. For those of you whose personality isn't 90% Warhammer, the other 10% is my cat, but the Warhammer designs are amazing and they keep introducing more. I was thinking about getting some Adeptus Custodes for home security reasons. Now, making a real custodian requires you to remake a person at the genetic level, but putting a Displate poster up in your room is delightfully simple. It requires 0 tools and is safe for your walls, and swapping out your posters is thereafter really easy. So if you do need to hide the fact that you actually quite like Tau, I just think battlesuits are kind of cool, then you can just take off that poster and replace it for something else. The new texture designs are a fantastic addition. With this cool 3D effect, I can practically feel him marching for Macragge. So if you are interested in transforming your walls today, there's a link in my description and the comment section. I am not ashamed of this weapon. I'm proud of what I've done. I am your Emperor's oldest adversary, his fiercest detractor. I have opposed his great plan since he first began to execute it. He has tried to end me and silence me many times, yet now he needs me. Now my way of engineering the future will prove the more efficacious. That was Basilio Fo, a man who describes himself as a worker of obscenity. He is an expert in biomechanism and organic engineering, having amassed a massive amount of knowledge over his exceedingly long lifetime. He is even known to have stolen from the gene witches of the Selenar. Because of his talents, by the time of the Siege of Terra, he is over 5,000 years old. He was born towards the end of the Dark Age of technology and lived through the Age of Strife. We know, for example, that at times he even allied with some of the worst warlords and techno-barbarians on Terra. He unleashed his monstrosities and vile sciences on the birthworld of humanity and its population. Fo is a really interesting character because he knows he's a monster. He just wanted to play, to concoct things and see where they went. However, despite the genocides that he has committed over the millennia, he never actually sought to conquer Terra. Nevertheless, he did have his own enclaves and ruled them for many centuries. But despite his great talents, and despite the vast resources of the other techno-barbarians on Terra, none of them were a match for the new power rising, this new warlord who styled himself as the Emperor of Mankind. The accounts of the purge of his enclaves during unification, well, there are phrases that speak enough. Flesh husks, bio-resculpture, gene-phage torture, things that wanted to scream but could not. The others who opposed the Emperor all died. Cardinal Tang, Nathan Doom, the Crimson Walkers, all gone, but not him. He got away somehow. He was hunted for most of the Crusade, under the broadest remit and urgency. Complete and total destruction of his works and those who he had contact with. He is the last of the Lords of Old Night. As history tells us, the Emperor won the Wars of Unification, and he did need cohorts of scientists for his burgeoning Imperium. But the ideological differences between Fo and himself meant they could never work together. Fo fled and travelled far away until he found sanctuary on the world of Veliktan. He ruled there for multiple lifetimes, however he knew that one day the Emperor or his forces would come, and when they did, he could not win. He resolved to make his last stand count for something. If not defeat the Emperor, then eliminate the greatest of his party. Eliminate its leader. The leader that came for him was Horus Lupercal. Even the Space Marines of the Lunar Wolves Legion struggled against the creations of Fo. They named his creations Cyberberserkers, Biome Cannibals, or Misbegots. They were feral horrors, nightmares made flesh. However, Fo held back his greatest creation, a titanic Misbegot, because he was waiting for the Primarch. The Misbegot was the size of 3 landing ships. It had bored up through rock and soil beneath the Lunar Wolves' forward base. Endless rows of grinding teeth had gnawed the ground away. Great loops and ridges of muscle had pulsed to heave the giant thing along its burrow. It had no form, yet it had all forms. It was a vast bulk, a slab of flesh reinforced with a ribcage that would have made the frame of a generous dwelling hall. Yet it was also a writhing forest of limbs, of clawing hands, of amputee stumps that wedged and stabilized its weight. It was eyes, wide and weeping, clustered like egg sacs. It was mouths, some opening in its center mass, some lunging forward on whip-spined necks, every gullet specialized and distinct. One to snap, one to bite, one to grind, one to sever, one to grasp and hold as others fed. It had no symmetry whatsoever. It was a sample of organic nightmares and anatomical shocks fused in one flesh, resembling no creature, terrestrial or Xenos. Yet, its one defining horror was that it and every disparate part of it was unmistakably human. Undeterred by this fleshy nightmare, Horus Lupercal still managed to slay the beast, and so he confronted Basilio Fo. Although Horus is disgusted, Fo is disgusted as well, for when he looks at the Primarch, he sees a monster beyond his wildest deliriums, a monster that could do far more than anything he has ever created: burn the galaxy down. Despite Fo's insults, Horus decides to let him live, to drag him back to Terra in chains and bring him before his father. Horus had hoped that in this enlightened age, Basilio Fo might come to know his error and learn to appreciate the truth that the Emperor of Mankind brought salvation for our race. Naturally, this never came to pass, and Fo languished in the Imperial dungeon, waiting for his ancient adversary to descend from on high and smite him with his burning sword. 15 years after his capture, still on ancient Terra, Basilio Fo heard thunder approaching. The birthworld of humanity was under siege, and by forces led by the man who had captured him, Horus Lupercal. Basilio Fo had been proven right. Horus had turned on his father, and as a result, the galaxy burned. During the Siege of Terra, Fo and many other criminals were moved to another prison, the Blackstone. By this point, Fo had spent 15 years without access to his studio, and so aging had finally come for this war criminal. He just looked like a frail old man. Nevertheless, for 15 years, he had time to think about his failings, think about what he could do differently, and how he could come up with a weapon that could destroy Horus Lupercal and the other transhuman creations of the Emperor. And what do you know? One day during the siege, the servants of the Emperor came to him, and after finding out what he could do, asked him to do just that. When, once in a while, every couple of lifetimes during his long exile on Veliktan, he thought about Terra. Fo dreamed sad dreams of the world that he would have made from it, the future he would have shaped. Fo's Imperium would have been superior, a post-human extrapolation of the species devised along pure biomechanical lines, not this dystopian, hyper-militarized hierarchy. Fo would have eschewed any dependence on legacy genetics, psionics, and most especially, the warp. He would not have called it an Imperium, and he most surely would not have declared himself Emperor. But he'd lost that fight, lost it long ago, during the ferocious centuries of the Age of Strife. The Emperor had prevailed, and Fo had fled to the stars. And because, as the old adage says, history is written by the victors, the Emperor is now the savior of mankind, and Fo is a war criminal, a monster, the personification of all the wrongs that the Emperor has come to make right. Except Fo wasn't wrong. The world is literally falling apart. Doom has come to Terra. Fo takes little satisfaction from that, but there is some vindication there. The Emperor's overweening scheme has brought about this calamity. His militarized hierarchy, his legacy genetics, his careless employment of psionics, his foolhardy alliance with immaterial power. These things, these foundational principles of his Imperium, are precisely the elements that have brought its fall. At this point in the video, it's important that I explain to you another kind of side story, but it's important overall. So, it turns out that during the Siege of Terra, the Primarch Rogal Dorn may have accidentally started the Inquisition. Dorn authorized the creation of the Order of Interrogation, which was led by Kirill Sinderman, who will go on to become one of the first Inquisitors, and they use the famous inquisitorial eye as the symbol of their authority. Therefore, it looks to me like this order is the precursor to the enigmatic Inquisition. Nevertheless, the original purpose of the order was just supposed to be a new order of remembrancers. The Remembrancer Order had been disbanded early into the Horus heresy, yet now Rogal Dorn starts this new order, the general idea being that the Siege of Terra is a momentous event and somebody should probably record what is happening here. Anyhow, in his new role, Sinderman conducts a series of interrogations or interviews, but he doesn't do them alone. He is accompanied by the custodian Ammon and Euphrates Keeler, a woman who will go on to become one of the first Imperial Saints. For believing in the Emperor's divinity, Keeler herself had been imprisoned in the Blackstone, and so the three of them interview other prisoners in the Blackstone, and one of those prisoners is Basilio Fo. In this interview, he tells them that he has come up with a weapon that he believes will end the Horus heresy. However, there is a slight problem with the weapon, and that problem is that the weapon won't stop there. He proposed the manufacture of a biomechanical phage, tailored and specific. I have no question that he is capable of it. The phage would kill Horus Lupercal, yes, because it would be coded to wipe out everything of that gene-altered pattern in the Imperium. Horus, yes, and every Primarch, and every Legionary, on both sides. It would exterminate the transhuman genetic lineage of mankind. As the story goes on, you'll see that this weapon kind of develops. However, this is the core of it, essentially a phage or a virus that could be unleashed and would kill all Space Marines and Primarchs, anything that is underneath that gene code. And these servants of the Emperor are so desperate to end the heresy, they are willing to consider using this horrific biological weapon. Fo is not only confident that he could create this, in fact, he knows he can because he's been planning it for a very long time. However, of course, Fo is intent on escaping, and so he's trying to bide his time. And one of the ways he does this is by drip feeding information about the weapon over the various interviews that come afterwards, not letting them know that actually he's kind of already figured everything out. Like all his art, he could see it in his mind as real as if the molecules and essential substances hung before his eyes, spinning as they combined and transformed. They had not known that though. How could they? Neither did they know that he could have written out perfect formulae for the substance's creation in a day. The last set of formulations lay on the screen of the data slate beside him, discarded for now. He had a feeling that the currency of that secret was soon going to be devalued, and besides, its promise had already bought him time, and that was all that counted. Biding his time, Fo is planning an escape. He manages to pull a shard of blackstone off of the wall of his prison, which he keeps hidden, and he also tries to bring his warden, a Solar Auxilia veteran called Vascale, under his control. He has been subtly using mimetic implantation through linguistic and voice tonal suggestion. It's a slow process, but it will work over time. However, Fo never had to use these. He would secretly be freed. His unlikely saviour was Andromeda 17, a gene witch of the Selenar who had been recruited into the Loyalist cause. Vascale was in fact under her control. You would be correct to assume that Andromeda hates Fo for his past crimes against her cult. However, she says that her true loyalty is to ensuring humanity's survival, and in her opinion, the only way a solution can emerge is through random chance. The more factors that are in play, the more chance humanity has, and therefore she decides to release this ancient mad scientist. Fo is now free to roam around the Imperial Palace that is currently under siege. He put on the staff uniform of an Interior Departamento Armaments Inspector that had been unlucky enough to run into him whilst he was making his escape. Fo did manage to avoid the custodians and find a laboratory where he could begin his work. His project was going pretty well, right up to the point that a Night Lord's Legionnaire found him. Fo noticed that this traitorous Space Marine was covered in markings and had clearly made pacts with the Dark Powers. The Astarte informs Fo that he knows who he is. He has clearly been briefed by the Ruinous Powers, and Fo is such a wild card, even they are not sure what to do about him. You exist in several futures, and you do not exist in many more. By rights, you should have been killed already, and yet, here you are, a stubborn fly to swat. I do not know what does the most harm, letting you live or killing you now. This is such an interesting addition to Fo's storyline because even the powers of chaos can't really ever trust Fo despite his hatred of the Emperor because he possesses tremendous ability, but he is just self-interested. He's never wanted to serve the Dark Powers within the Warp. After deliberating on whether to kill Fo or not for a short amount of time, the traitorous Astarte eventually comes to the conclusion that it's far simpler just to kill Fo now. However, Fo has an unlikely saviour yet again because all of a sudden, Constantine Valdor himself appears. Fo is returned to the Custodian Ammon's custody where he finally completes the device. The custodians thereafter are planning to confiscate the device and secure it within the Dark Cells, and with Fo no longer needed, they even discuss executing him. However, Andromeda then appears again and tells Ammon that Basilio Fo may have made a mistake in underestimating what the Emperor did in order to create the Primarchs and the Space Marines.
His weapon will kill Astartesian flesh. I'm talking a galactic slaughter, the crowning glory of his horrible career. But the Astartes aren't merely flesh, are they? Nothing is. Each body is connected to a soul, and each soul is inextricably linked to the warp. That is the nature of reality, and not something Fo has studied. So if activated, his weapon will not entirely purge the Astartes. It will leave a significant portion of their essence in the warp.
Now, initially Fo doesn't actually agree with this and is pretty confident that his weapon will work well. However, there is another problem with his weapon. Whilst the phage is designed to be effective versus Astartesian genetics, there is still going to be a risk to the general populace. It is, after all, a biological weapon. Therefore, after using the device, billions or potentially trillions of innocent civilians could be killed as a consequence. So whilst at this stage Fo has made an Astartes killing weapon, it will have a pretty significant side effect in the deaths of trillions of innocent civilians, and whilst the Astartes line will be destroyed at a genetic level, their souls will persist in the warp. Undoubtedly as an agitated and potentially disruptive force that would have dire long-term effects on real space. In addition, because of chaos, corruption and demonhood, there are some traitors who are essentially drenched in the warp, and these Astartes might avoid all consequences entirely. So ultimately the group comes to the conclusion that Fo's weapon needs refinement. In order to improve the device, Fo needs to study the Immaterium. Now, normally you could just go to the Emperor's personal library to do this, the Hall of Leng. However, that's very far away and has got traitorous space marines all around it, so that's out of the question. However, the Sigillite's personal retreat is in reach, and so Ammon and Andromeda take Fo there. However, there is another person to introduce to this story. At this point in the Siege of Terra, the Anabasis assault is underway. That's when the Emperor and his cohort have teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit to take on Horus Lupercal. Malcador the Sigillite now sits the throne. As one of Malcador's last acts, he telepathically passed on many of his projects. One of them was signified Tier XX and deemed a Terminus Sanction. Malcador had been aware of the plan involving Fo all along. The Sigillite, or the hero as he will now be known, assigned his final projects to a group known as Malcador's Chosen. And initially he gives the Terminus Sanction to the Chosen Hassan, but he passes it on to Zaranchek Xanthus. Xanthus joins Ammon and Andromeda to the Sigillite's retreat. Fo examines Malcador's private materials, and though he previously believed his device would have worked perfectly, he now realizes that he can build a far more impressive weapon. He can use Malcador's laboratory and notes to create a device that is far more precise. According to Fo, this new weapon will operate without a great risk to the general population. It will account for the fact that the Space Marines and the Primarchs have a soul that coexists within the warp, and the phage will be synthesized in a generic form. However, it can be simply encoded via splice markers to target specific groups based on their gene factor. That means this weapon can be used to just go after the traitor legions and their Primarchs, leaving everyone else largely untouched. I will just note that the exact risk to the general populace and the loyalist Astartes is not entirely clear, because in the next book, Fo does say that trillions of people will die whether they use the weapon or not. Fo begins working and he starts preparing a range of gene code samples to allow the weapon to target. He has to systematically test the principles of the biomechanical phage on those samples in order to finesse and calibrate its efficacy. To do this properly, according to Fo, he needs a control group, and so he requests for some blood from Xanthus, who obliges. And so finally, with all of the missing pieces, Basilio Fo completes his work. The phage is synthesized. In theory, this weapon could wipe out all of the traitor legions, but leave the loyalist legions and their Primarchs largely untouched. Henceforth, and to modern 40k, this is probably the most powerful weapon that the loyalist forces have against the traitor legions. However, at that point during the siege, the Primarch Vulcan is the ultimate authority on Terra, and so, according to Xanthus, they would need his permission to use it. Nevertheless, with this development, Andromeda leaves the laboratory and relays this information to Ammon. But Ammon actually decides to counteract this decision. Ammon is at this point not sure whether the Emperor is alive, whether any of the Loyalist forces are still alive, so he makes the decision to use this weapon and use it to target all of the legions. The Primarchs and their sons have brought us to this pass. We trust no one. We trust nothing. We allow no sentiment or weakness to cloud our judgment or stay our hand. We must be certain. Do I need to repeat my directive? Even Andromeda is hesitant to use the weapon in this way. This custodian is 100% willing to kill all of the Space Marines and the Primarchs at this point in time. Andromeda accepts his directive and returns to the laboratoria, but when she gets there, she finds quite the scene. Xanthus has had his throat cut and is barely alive, and Fo is making his escape. Andromeda engages, and though she stabs him in the eye, he sprays her with an aerosol diffuser that has a tailor-made bacteria inside of it that causes her face and throat to dissolve. Fo then makes for the Sigillite's private ferry to escape, but Ammon finds him first. Basilio Fo dies with a look on his face that could be surprise or disappointment, or perhaps some weird kind of satisfaction. And in the end, despite Ammon's directive, they never had to use Fo's weapon, because as we all know, the Emperor prevailed against his son, and so ended the Horus heresy. And so that's it, that's the story of the Terminus Sanction's creation. It is afterwards taken into the custody of the custodians, Basilio Fo is dead, and yet you've probably noticed that the runtime of this video tells us that this story is not over. Towards the end of the novel, there's a passage where a patched up Xanthus is clearing up the laboratoria in Malcador's retreat. Everything within it must now be destroyed since the work is done. Everything must be checked and double checked. Nothing must be left behind. The last portion of biomatter placed in the incinerators was the final residue of primary sample group Xanthus. He loaded it for disposal himself. The incinerators roar softly, belying the intense heat within. It's all there, and not a trace of it will remain when the cycle ends. Not a strand of DNA, not a scrap of ash that can be typed. All of it, including the dismembered body of the original Zaranchek Xanthus. Xanthus gathers up a few data slates and a few sheaves of documents, and places them inside a file case. He includes the pages he purloined from the Regent's notebooks when nobody was looking. And he adds carefully Basilio Fo's notebooks too, the ones he was allowed to keep during his incarceration, for I will certainly be needing those. This is a massive development for the setting of Warhammer 40k. In that passage, the original Zaranchek Xanthus was disposed of, implying that Basilio Fo was able to use the sample of blood that Xanthus gave him, create a new Zaranchek Xanthus body, and either put his consciousness or clone his consciousness into that new body. That means that going into the Scouring, the last Lord of Old Night, this ancient enemy of the Emperor, who now has knowledge he has taken from the personal retreat of Malcador the Sigillite, is still operating. For example, if he wants to, he could design and make another Terminus Sanction. To make things even more bizarre, we do actually have records on what happened to Zaranchek Xanthus after the Siege of Terra. He goes on to become an Inquisitor, and he actually starts his own ideology. Xanthism is one of the oldest philosophies of the Inquisition, named after Zaranchek Xanthus, who was executed as a heretic in M32. Xanthus was accused of chaos worship, and although he professed his innocence strongly, he was eventually burnt at the stake by his fellow Inquisitors. Throughout, Xanthus had maintained that he remained pure, though he admitted that he did on occasion utilize the forces of the warp and chaos to achieve his goals. It was his firm stance that such power could be harnessed without the spiritual corruption of the wielder that was later taken up by other Inquisitors. It is the ultimate goal of the Xanthites to harness the power of chaos for mankind. They believe that chaos cannot be defeated, for it is merely a reflection of humanity itself. However, those energies and powers created by its existence can be turned back for the benefit of humanity, rather than being an enemy. This does not mean that they advocate giving in to chaos, but rather wish to capture the essence of chaos and turn it to useful rather than destructive purposes. Xanthites investigate all aspects of the warp and chaos, imbuing its power into themselves where possible, destroying it only when necessary. They will use chaos-tainted artifacts, demon weapons, books of chaos lore, and other heretical items, utilizing the abilities of these weapons and tools to combat the incursions of chaos, heretics, and aliens. Within the Xanthites, there are those whose beliefs go even further, known as Horusians. The Horusians look to the Primarch Horus, who was a mighty being conferred with immense chaos power, and see an opportunity wasted. They believe that a new Horus could be created, invested with great energy from the warp, but one who would unite all of mankind for its betterment, rather than enslaving it to chaos. Most other Inquisitors consider the Xanthites, and particularly Horusians, to be walking along the edge of a precipice. Xanthites are commonly seen amongst the Inquisition as arrogant and dangerous, toying with powers they do not fully comprehend. However, as one of the oldest philosophies of the Inquisition, and including among their number some of the most learned and powerful Inquisitors, it is a brave or rash Inquisitor who will stand alone against the Xanthites. Most often, as was the case with Xanthus himself, a cell of Inquisitors will form a common cause against a particular Xanthite in an effort to expose his perceived heresies and to deal justice. So Zaranchek Xanthus, who we know to be Basilio Fo, operated as an Inquisitor after the heresy, and seemingly became obsessed with the warp and chaos. I cannot wait to see what they do with this storyline, and what his motives become. Are the Horusians correct? Will he try and create a new copy of his ancient foe, Horus Lupercal, and if so, for what purpose? Officially, Fo, or Xanthus, does die in M32, brought down by other Inquisitors, but let's remember, Fo already avoided death once. I think there's a very real chance that he will avoid it once again, and we may even see Xanthus or Fo resurface 10,000 years later in M42. As for the Terminus decree itself, there are still many questions behind this weapon. For one, how does it end up on Titan? At the end of the Siege of Terra, the Custodians take it to be kept in the Dark Cells. So at some point during the Scouring, we will see the Custodians hand over this device to the newly founded Grey Knights. Why were the Custodians not trusted to guard this device? Is there something about the Grey Knights that makes them the perfect guardians of this weapon? As you heard in the story, this phage will attack the parts of the Astartes and Primarchs in the warp. Perhaps a powerful Psyker is needed to somehow coordinate this weapon. One other thing I was wondering about whilst making this video is, can this weapon be used to target other groups, as it is targeted based on gene factor? It's not clear, but does this mean, for example, that it can be used to target non-Space Marine groups, like Genestealer cults or just other Xenos? At this point in the video, you may be wondering, why haven't the Imperium used this weapon to target the traitor legions? Well, the Custodians were very much aware of Fo's hatred for the Emperor's transhuman creations, and I think they are understandably hesitant to use his device. What if the targeting doesn't work, and all the Space Marines loyal to the Emperor are likewise killed by the phage? What if Fo made an error when he calibrated the weapon, or it mutates to attack the general population? Ultimately, should Kaldor Draigo one day decide to use the Terminus decree, it could lead to a swift victory for the Imperium against the traitor legions. But there is probably just as good a chance that it kills untold trillions, leaving just the Chapter Master of the Grey Knights left, surrounded by the terrifying laughter of the Dark Gods. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of this new lore. Have you got any theories about what the writers are going to do with the various plot points we've discussed today? please do like and subscribe, and if you enjoy this kind of content, please do consider joining the channel on the page below to get yourself access to extra videos and the Discord. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.